We will be engaging with a distinguished panel for about 30 minutes and then enter into a period of 15 minutes where we have an opportunity for some questions and answers and conversation with our three panelists. I'll introduce them to you in just a moment, but I'd like you to be aware that the style of this webinar, as well as the subsequent three that will be scheduled late this spring, are going to be conversational in tone. We want to make sure that there's an opportunity for our panelists to share ideas with the field and to engage in some interaction with all of you if you have questions or comments. If we're unable to get to all of the questions in the webinar, please continue to send them to us by email. We'll respond to them within the next 48 hours. We don't have elaborate slides for this webinar, but for some of the subsequent webinars, there will be slide decks. Those will all be distributed to those that have registered for the webinar. Thank you again for your interest in this topic. We're going to be dealing with the art of effective board chairpersons in this webinar. My name again is Jim Rice. I am the Managing Director for Governance and Leadership of Integrated Healthcare Strategies, soon to be modifying our name to Gallagher Integrated within the Arthur J. Gallagher system of companies, a large brokerage firm that works across the United States and in 130 countries. We're looking at three key questions in our conversation with our panelists that you see on slide 1. And I'd like to now introduce you to the individuals that we'll be talking with today. On the side of the screen, you see Richard, or Dick Blair. Dick served for several years on a wide range of hospital and health system boards, all in the nonprofit tax-exempt arena. He has retired as a chief executive officer for a large integrated delivery system that many on this webinar may be aware of, based in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, called Allina Health System. You'll see the wide range of other boards that he's been privileged to serve on. And we'll be engaging him in the conversation as well. Next in our panel is Lori LaFontaine. She has a finance background as well. She's serving actively now in a large number of nonprofit boards in the social welfare and health arena. She's devoted a large part of her career, as Dick has, into the health field of the United States. Finally, on the panel today is Brian Osberg. Brian serving on a number of nonprofit and tax-exempt boards. He's been active in his career in health policy, health system delivery, and health finance as well. All three are quite experienced, both as executives interacting with boards and now over the last several years serving on boards, and are active board chair people as well. So it's my pleasure to welcome all three of you to the conversation today. We're going to, as you know, explore the role of the board chairperson, why it's important, and how they can discharge some of their responsibilities and an opportunity to guide their institution by guiding the way the board governs the affairs of a hospital or a health system or some kind of integrated model. I'm going to ask each of you to do most of the talking, but I would just acknowledge that this is the first of 4 webinars. And we've intentionally framed this to look at the role of the board chairperson. They play a critical role, and boards in themselves in the healthcare sector of the United States are facing big challenges. And over the next 3 to 5 years, the confusion and the complexity of governing these large integrated delivery systems is going to become even more complicated and complex. Hence the important role that board chair people play with the board colleagues and also, of course, with the chief executives. So what we'd like to do in the next few minutes is see if you have some ideas that you've developed in your own experiences as board chairpersons. The first question I'm going to ask is related to some of the challenges in having the board chair be successful. What are the issues and obstacles and challenges and frustrations that you might see board chair persons having to wrestle with now and over the next 3 to 5 years as well. I'm first going to start with Brian, and then we'll go to Lori and then to Dick with some of your observations. We'll want to keep this informal. Each of you will have a chance to share observations, and if you have a way or desire to raise a question or comment with one of your colleagues, please feel free to do that as well. So, Brian, the first question that we have are some of the challenges that you as a board chair and your colleagues that you see around the country are likely to be dealing with. What do you see as some of those issues?
Yes, Jim, the critical thing for a board chair is to understand the bigger picture. What's going on in their marketplace? What are the things going forward in terms of aligning potentially with other organizations? What's the policy development in their state, and of course, what's happening in Washington, D.C.? Board chairs need to manage their board, meaning they need to make sure that they manage the fine line between board oversight and board intrusion, make sure that the board is really nose in, fingers out. It also includes managing the committees of the board, certainly, but also looking at how best to manage risk and manage the financial affairs of the organization going forward through their committee structure.
Good, thank you. We'll come back and give you a chance and others to explain how to do some of those important things, but they do seem to be important challenges. Lori, you look at your own role as a board chairperson, and again, both sides, both an exec and a board member, what do you see to be some of the challenges that board chair people have to deal with?
I think it's about balance, and particularly between strategic and operational, as well as fiduciary, and making time in board meetings for having generative conversations. I think to make sure that you're balancing the need to get things done on a timely basis and the need to really have the important conversations. So things like a strategic retreat, and to make sure that the right agenda are getting played out. But more importantly, that every voice is heard. In other words, there's always the extroverts like me that are talking away and got to raise their hand and talk about everything. And there are the introverts who are more thoughtful and less likely to speak up. So I think it's important as a board chair to make sure all voices are heard. So one technique I'll sometimes use is to say, okay, we've heard this is a really important decision for the organization. We've heard from a number of board members. Let's go around and hear from those who haven't had an opportunity to speak. Mm-hmm. Just to kind of take time to make sure everybody's checked in on that. And I think that that's really important as a board chair. You're kind of like the conductor of the orchestra, and you got to make sure that everybody's playing and that there isn't dissidence that happens outside of the board meeting. It should make sure that it happens in the meeting and that people have an opportunity to speak up. I think it's, as Brian said, really not losing sight of the big picture in this kind of sea of minutia right now. I think there's a number of board members who are not in the middle of healthcare, so they're having trouble keeping up with it. One board I'm on actually does a board education piece the day before and then goes into the full board meeting the next day. And I think that that's helpful because many times it's people like the three of us who spent our careers in healthcare on boards. Many times there's the local lawyer, construction, and other people. And so I think making sure there's appropriate time for education and orientation is important. Mm-hmm.
So we're hearing from both of the first two panelists, this sense of balance is wise to nurture. You talked about the strategic balance, and that's reinforced by Lori, how to look for the knowledge so that the agenda is balanced. But Lori also mentioned balancing listening, so all the voices have a chance to be fully engaged. When talking with you, Dick, you've expressed some similar things. How do you look at the whole area of challenges that board chair people are going to have to wrestle with, and what are some of the things you think we should be paying attention to?
I had two that popped in my mind right away. One is the responsibility that the chair has to manage the whole governance process. Brian touched on committees. It's the committees, how the board runs, how it relates. I know later we'll cast it into the regional boards and local boards, but all of that fall under the chair's responsibility. So you really have to understand governance to make that work. The one that I think all of us are struggling with is we have in healthcare that the next number of years is going to be really tough. So, and financials be really hard. So we're all thinking, how do we manage that process? What do we do different? And the case of the boards I'm on, we're thinking, well, we got to come up with all sources of revenue and so forth. Anybody who's been in healthcare for a while, you probably have heard that before, but it's back again. The dilemma for a board chair is you can't do it. It's a management thing, but it's a team. So your job is to bring that board along with management, so you're all dealing with it.
So this is an important point is making, and it builds on what we've heard from Brian and Lori. Part of the role of the board is to cultivate and grow the board. As you say, bring along board members. That's easy to talk about. It's difficult to do. I'd be curious what each of you are trying to do in your various board chair roles to seek that balance, to bring them along, to help them stay sharp and focused, to give them a voice, let them run over you or run over the CEO. So let's have just a little bit of a conversation about how we would, you see dealing with that challenge of bringing board members along. They may not be expert in healthcare. How do you create that? We'll start with you, Lori, and see what, if you've had some particular approaches of how you bring board members along with you. And I don't mean to imply that you guys, as three of you, have all the answers. I know that you're self-facing and you're trying to continually stay smart yourself. But how do you approach that challenge?
You know, I think there's a number of ways. There's the formal and informal. The formal really is the orientations and also committee orientations. And as a committee, many times I check in with the new members as well, informally. And one board I'm on, we actually assign peer mentors. There's a board person that kind of checks in with the new board member and does that. But, you know, all else fails. I was on a board where the guy was just, Brian's point, knifo, nose in, fingers out. His fingers were all over in there, and he was an expert on everything. And, you know, I did my evaluation, and I said to the board chair, boy, you really got to, and I knew that as the board chair's responsibility to really take him aside and say, you know, let me give you some examples where we think you crossed that line. And so I think there's really the formal and then there's kind of the informal. And one of the things that we did on one of our boards is really the back and taxi to the airport conversations. And when you start having those in the boardroom, you've really probably mastered having a good board member and a good team of board members in play. Not that you've got groupthink, but you're going to have the tougher conversations in the boardroom versus being critical of what happened in the boardroom and not speaking up.
It's so important to guard against that temptation to do the boardroom in the parking lot afterwards or in the back seat of the taxi. Brian, how do you look at this challenge of bringing some of your board colleagues along with you? And I'll come back to all of you, too, this idea of how you evaluate that you may have a weak link in the board. How do you bring a particular weak link along, or maybe eventually ask them to leave or ask them if they're in the right place at the right time? But first of all, general comments, Brian, please.
Well, as Lori mentioned, in fact, she's my mentor on a board, Clearway, Minnesota board here in Minnesota, which is very helpful. Mentoring, formal mentoring of board members by other board members is important. And Lori also mentioned board education, having sessions whereby you focus on information that's relevant to the organization, of course, so that the members are all on the same page. I think that things like that can certainly be done and done effectively.
Great, thank you. Dick, how do you?
Jim, if I could add,
Sure.
I thought what they just said, but there were a couple others I'd add. Retreats, a chance to do those. One is education. At least one of the boards, we expect everybody to go to an education session. I mean, paid for it, but we expect them to do it. And the third one is committees. And when they're on committees, we encourage like members to meet with staff and go have lunch and learn. If you're on a finance committee, go lunch with the CFO and get to know if it works better. So there's vehicles you can do like that.
Well, this is Brian. We're right now pursuing the notion, with your help, Jim, in fact, of developing a governance academy. I chair a community center board here in Minneapolis, 17 FQs, or community health centers in Minnesota. And with the idea of developing a governance academy where board members can then become very educated in the various issues related to community health. So, and you've done that, I know, elsewhere. So that can be done as well.
Good, thank you. We're going to move into some of the knowledge and skills and attitudes, or in other words, the competencies that good board chairpersons need. I'd like to give each of you a chance to talk about 2 or 3 of the big competencies that you think are important. You've already started to hint some of that here. And then I'm going to follow up with how are you developing those competencies? Are there courses to go? How do you find a one-page that you could read on how to be an excellent board chair? But let's first talk with the competencies. And Dick, maybe we could start with you. How do you look at the skills, the knowledge, the attitudes that great board chair people need? And we'll get insights from each of them. We'll talk a little bit how do you develop those.
First, I should clarify, if we're talking about great board members, then this doesn't apply to me.
Facing as always.
On the list, the priority, but I had experience, patience, lift skills, you beg people. Here is effective, and the last one is wisdom. From my perspective, experience is a really key factor. You don't have to have been a board chair, but you have to be on enough boards so you've seen how board chairs work. It's difficult for someone who's never been on a board to become a board chair right away, so it helps to have knowledge of it. The other one that I would do is you have to listen to what people say, and myself that I'm listening, and then I find out later, no, I wasn't, because that's not what they were saying to me. So, looking forward.
We touched on that earlier, where even near the end of a meeting, you can ask, how have we been accomplishing enough? You can stage some of the structured listening opportunities as well. We'll come back to those.
Yeah, if I could piggyback
Sure.
too, Jim. I think to have the chair to follow up individually with each person. It doesn't have to be at a meeting, but in some time between meetings, each person, talk to them and see if that helps too.
Yeah, it's a rapport with your colleagues on the board as well as the chief exec. We'll come to the chief exec in a moment as well. How do you look at this challenge of the competencies, the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes?
Well, you can work for Dick in my career because patience and humor were my first 2 as well. And you know, I've watched Dick do it in board meetings, and I've chose to do it too, and it can be really effective to break things up a little bit. But I think the other thing is really build relationships, both inside and outside of the boardroom as you were moving on, so that it's setting expectations for what you expect out of the committee chairs, participating in those meetings, and making sure that board members feel active and engaged. Many times in healthcare boards I've been involved is sometimes at the committee level you have non-board members. They have audit expertise or investment expertise many times. And so it's also helping them stay engaged to the bigger picture so that they can do their job effectively. But I think that relationship piece with all of the board members, and so Dick's comments in terms of connecting with them outside the meeting, I think is really important as well. And I think there's got to be some time for some socialization pieces for board to really accomplish some of those things as well. Be it a dinner or, exhibitions that they buy a gala of all things, the things where we're
a little bit of friendship can go a long way. That collegiality can be useful. Brian, how do you look at the competencies, and we'll go into brief comments about how to develop those?
Yeah, it's critical that the chair be a good diplomat, ability to work with a set of stakeholders, start physicians, with the community. So you need to understand how best to negotiate, if you will, with various stakeholders and be diplomatic about that. Also requires, I think, great leadership skills in general, authentic leadership and integrative leadership, meaning ability to really bring together stakeholders to come to a common end. And stewardship. A board chair needs to be a steward, leaving the organization better off than he or she found that organization. I think stewardship is a critical competency of a board. Ability to listen, communication skills, and organizational skills. Obviously, those kind of things are necessary as well.
We have one question that's come in. I think this is not tongue-in-cheek, a serious one. Have the competencies changed in light of the new administration that has joined us and looking at changing health reforms or the style of leadership? We take a lot of time on this, and I want to also come back a little bit later in the conversation about how do we bring diversity into the conversation as well. This is an ongoing challenge, a lot of service now, but how do we look at that? And this is not just the board chair, obviously, it's a partnership between the board chair and the CEO as well. So, Paul, as you look out at the changing landscape, we've got uncertain health reforms. How does the board chair look at this uncertainty, these troubled waters that we're going into, and how should the board address that? Does it agile or competencies at all in your view?
It does. One scene is with what happened the last few years and with Obamacare and so forth, the need to have people that understand population health takes on a different magnitude than it did a few years ago. The other one is, you touched on it, Jim, is diversity. We've talked about it, but we move so slow on it. And when I say diversity, it's not just race. It's in its age. I personally believe if you really are going to have an effective board, you get them all. You can't have all old people as example. You can have all men. You can't. It's good, and that's we don't do very well.
You've been wrestling with this of all the boards you serve on. I know you're serving on a federally qualified health center, which has some obligations that 51% have to come from the people you're serving. How is your board intentionally trying to cultivate diversity?
Yes, a couple of things. One, in terms of recruitment to our board, we're very anxious about that. And for Cal Center, in fact, the majority of the board needs to be patients of the organization, and so that helps do that. This kind of stage, you need to really be able to manage ambiguity, frankly. And I think it's always been the case in healthcare. It seems, but it's more so than ever. Manage that and be very flexible, but to reach out to the community. A nonprofit organization is a community asset, so it should represent the community well, especially demographic aspects of the community.
I know all three of you know it doesn't just happen, and you can't just go talk with Peter Law Firm or in the bank or in the country club to get new talent into the board. Lori, and some of the nonprofits and social service groups that you've been involved in, what advice would you give us to at least think about the challenge of working harder at diversity?
You know, I think it's not using your networks, but using your other networks as well, looking across the country. So, for instance, my first foray into being on a health system board was sitting first on our audit committee because I had that expertise. So recruiting people in as non-board members to bring a specific expertise, and then as I was learning about the organization and had the ability to advance, I did that. But I literally, knew that I professionally that was their head of internal audit. That's how I got connected. It wasn't that I knew a board member. And so I think there's just different ways and to look across the country, because many times healthcare is pretty local, even with some of the bigger systems, and they want competency-based boards, not necessarily constituency-based boards. And so looking for expertise. I'm sure your organization can help, as our headhunters as well, starting to compile profiles. With audit experience, in theory, are in short demand. are in demand, but short supply. But I think that there is ways of getting at them with technology and LinkedIn and all of that today. Similar with diversity, I sit on a board that right now is sort of population that is the African American and Native American are more impacted, and so we're looking for people there. I reached out into my networks and my other smaller nonprofits to the CEO and asked her to connect me with people as well. But I also got to understand what you're looking for when you say and what you want, and make sure that you're really crisp about it, because one of the things that's been bugging me lately is cybersecurity is hot on everybody's list. The National Association of Corporate Directors are number one issue, and all of a sudden everybody wants to slam a CIO on your board. Well, they might not necessarily have, to Dick's comments earlier, experience and understanding of governance and that to be sitting at the board level. However, perhaps they could join an audit committee and compliance committee and bring that expertise. So I think it's balancing all of those things.
A lot of time we're going to spend looking at that critical partnership between the board chairperson and the CEO. I'm anxious to hear how you're looking at the importance and value of that, some do's or taboos or some suggestions on how to go back to nurturing that. The last comment I want to make on diversity is that I'm hearing from you, and I know that it doesn't just happen. You've got to work outside of your networks, going to other chambers, other kinds of community groups to really work hard. It doesn't just happen if you sit back in the boardroom or in the hospital, the health system, reach out into the community to look for that talent. And you don't have to give up the competency-based dimension of it. There are a lot of talented folks out there, but you may have to work a little bit harder outside our normal circles to bring that talent in. So the key question is that essential partnership between board chair and the CEO. We could spend a whole hour on this, but I would like to hear what each of you have to suggest about that. Lori, if we could get a couple of your ideas about that partnership, how to do it, and maybe some things to avoid even.
You know, first priority is about being available and scheduling time. So, for instance, when I'm board chair now on a smaller board, we actually have a Wednesday morning 8 a.m. phone call. And sometimes it's a breakfast, and sometimes I'm in the office, but we touch base in that time period. This morning we spent a half hour, and it was really critical for the CEO to have sense direction. I'm the organized one, so I'm always trying to plan the next board meeting and make sure. And we just did a big strategic retreat, so now we've got kind of this big, hairy, audacious goal that we got to get moving on, and I want to make sure that we're on the same page to do that. I think being clear with your expectations of them, and of course those are always changing in today's environment, so make sure that you're really clear. And then one of the things that I'm pretty cognizant of is trying to take time to be complimentary when you see them doing something really well, and to make sure that you are authentic and specific in that, and likewise debrief about something in terms of that you think could have done differently, and have those conversations as well.
Good, thank you. We'll go to Brian for some of your thoughts. I noticed that we have a question here. This is a thing issue we'll get to in the Q&A, but it's how you're board chair and you're working in a state where you have a hospital authority and you've got a public meeting law that you're trying to cope with. There's about 9 states that have these kind of government or hospital authorities. Really tough to govern in those kind of environments. We'll come back to that in a moment. But Brian, looking at this partnership with the chief exec and the board chairperson, what are some factors that you found important to keep in mind?
Yeah, clearly it's critical that the partnership does exist. They need to be on the same page. Even a mentor-mentee relationship. What's a periodic evaluation? And the board has a formal evaluation each year, but the board chair needs to evaluate and CE performance periodically, maybe quarterly, and maybe not so formal, but at least to have some feedback so that the CEO knows where he or she stands. Second is need to have a succession plan in place and a contingency plan in case something happens at the management level, especially with the CEO. So I think formal planning, succession and contingency planning is really important as well.
Well, part of that succession planning, I mean, is to have the conversation before you step into the year with the exec. with clear expectations of what the performance goals are. You do that for the CEO, even if he's going to be with you for a couple of years, but certainly if you start looking for a replacement, it's being very clear on how do you define success for that CEO. So the succession discipline is good, but also the evaluation. We'll come back to some of that evaluation because I want to see if you guys as board chairpersons have been evaluated as well. So Dick, how do you look at this partnership and how do you nurture it?
I would add, it's extremely important that you each understand each other's roles. In other words, as board chair, I'm not the CEO, and the CEO has to understand as board chair, I'm his boss. So you got to understand those roles. I think it helps if you've each been on the other side. So the CEO was chair of the board, or as the board has been a top executive, that helps. Something that I thought is that you got to recognize that CEOs in a very lonely situation. They don't have anybody to talk to. They're at the top of the mountain, and there's no one they can talk to. So it's important that you develop the trust so you two can talk. He ought to, she ought to feel comfortable that they can talk to you with that conversation, say in private. As long as you recognize each other's roles, you can do that. So there were a couple that hit me.
Those are all good ones. In various ways, you've hinted at the need for this relationship to be built on trust and nurture trust. We all know that one of the fastest way to erode trust, even inside the board, is surprises. CEOs don't like surprises. Board chairs don't like surprises. So I think as we start looking at, and we'll go into now in a moment with our question and answer period with colleagues that have answered for this, I'm curious about two dimensions of the trust. About the value of evaluating chief execs. Have any of you been evaluated? Do your colleagues offer insight on how well you're doing running meetings, doing these good things, being a good and effective board chair, balancing, learning? I'll start with you, Brian, and then we'll go to Lori and Dick. Have you gone through a board chair evaluation? And if not, how would you suggest it be done?
We have done board evaluations. Two organizations I'm involved in have done board evaluations, and there's some mention the chair piece. It's part of that overall board evaluation.
Okay.
So it's a self-evaluation is what it is. And so we've done formal evaluations recently in organizations I'm involved in.
Yourself an A or a B or a C?
I don't know. But myself, mine's incomplete at this point. I have a lot more work to do. I'm sure I'm an effective board chair, but I do seek feedback from my fellow boards. As Dick mentioned early on, it's important that the chair reach out individually for private conversations with board members to get feedback and also to make sure that the board chair is
Thank you. Lori, your reaction?
You know, both the health systems I've sat on are reactive in their assessment processes, including board chairs, committee chairs, and they come anonymously, but, you know, you can certainly see where there's opportunities and where things are going well. And the smaller board that I've been chairing, when we did the CEO evaluation and went into private session afterwards, they all evaluated me fully. Was helpful because we had made some progress in terms of moving the CEO along, which was really helpful. I had done a survey broader, but they decided they were going to give me some feedback, which was positive. So to my point. But I think one of the things is really about picking your battles, even as you complete these evaluations. You know, to me, you shouldn't write stuff down and blast it out there in the evaluation if you really haven't had the conversation. And so I think sometimes you got to, just like a point all three of us have made, is you can't just wait until the annual evaluation and blast something else that's bothering you. You really should be having those conversations as they go along.
Good. And style has to welcome that. You can't feel like you're not sincere, right. And you have to show that you listen and do something if there is a suggestion. Dick, you've been on several boards. I'm sure that someone has wanted to correct your behavior as a board chair.
Well,
How
I was
would
gonna-
you go about doing that?
Well, I was going to add that we also have an evaluation every meeting, and in the chair is evaluated. And if a member has 3 negatives in a row, they're off the board. That's not true.
That is a challenge that we'll try and come back to. I'm curious if each of you have had to deal with sitting down with the board colleague and say, is this really the best place for you? Are you able to spend time? Your attendance is weak. Your contributions and participation may be weak. Before we get there, I want to deal with this, what I view as a very challenging issue, which is in public meeting states, or if you're on the board of an organization and you're chairing this, there's some unique challenges of how do you get information, how do you talk with the CEO. You can do some of that in private between meetings, but it varies by state. If you get 2 or 3 together, then it's like everything has to be public. Certain constraints on personal matters that might be private, perhaps some quality or issues that could be taken in an executive session. But I'm curious how any of you would change your attitudes or approaches if you're board chair of a publicly traded hospital, public exposed hospital, whether there's any different dynamic about how you would envision it. And if you haven't had direct experience, what might you envision to be the challenge of the skills, getting the information, putting people into that kind of an environment? Closest, I think, as I understand the boards you're serving on, is some of these federally regulated community health services. There's Brian. I'm curious, you don't have to be in the public domain and public exposure for your meetings, or do you now?
We do have requirements that, as I said earlier, the majority of our board members are patients of our community health center, but also that there's a restriction to how many people from the healthcare industry can be on the board, because it'd be overly influenced by other health systems, larger health systems. But Lori are on a public organization board. It's called Clearway Minnesota. It came out of the tobacco settlement back in the 90s to get involvement of tobacco cessation and prevention. And so we have to go through some very formal process. I was appointee by the governor to the board, and so you have to have a lot of formality, and you have to make sure you're very thorough in terms of your taking and how you go about conducting business, including making sure that there's votes, formal votes on matters, especially if there's people listening over the phone. So there's some formality that applies, I'm sure, to the public health authorities as well. You have to follow very closely and quite discipline, frankly, to do that. And so I think an opportunity, though, to reach out to the community through work as well.
Probably one of the most important things that happened at that board, though, and Brian, it might have been before you were on it, the attorneys came in and educated us around what that meant. So it was really clear that we understood it because, again, it was new to me. It was the first time I'd had that experience as well. And as Brian said, it's pretty good in terms of the formal piece. Now, I think your question is, do you behave differently? I don't find that I do behave differently. Probably the only component is executive sessions. You really can't go into executive sessions as you would like to sometimes, with the auditors, for instance, and those sorts of things. But the management chooses to leave is the way that happens, and we can visit with external auditors without the management team in play. But I think you be a little more cognizant of it, but we haven't had a lot of public attending either, because we haven't had major controversial issues like beach collector for the city or something like that draws big people into public arenas.
Well, there's in Q&A a question that's come in, a nuance of this that really makes it difficult is that oftentimes these public meeting law states also don't allow you to do intentional, proactive recruiting and orienting people. Sometimes you get who you get. They either stand for election or they're appointed, so you don't have complete control over the attitude and the skill sets and the experiences that you have. sometimes if you're literally in front of a TV every single meeting, it's not unheard of to have a board member play to the cameras for they have all kinds of agenda that happens. That makes it difficult. Dick, as you look at this challenge of how, if any, of your advice you'd change in a public meeting situation, react to that challenge?
I'm going to save a lot of time and quickly admit I'm nowhere near an expert. I have no experience in it, and in fact, if I got in that situation, I think I would go back to playing golf. I have a desire to get in that, and so I don't have any good wisdom to pass on. That's a tough job.
There are several hundred hospitals that and board chairpersons that have to deal with that challenge. Fewer of those every year because part of that frustration on the talent you're looking for into the board, but just being able to do business in a competitive and marketplace and environment is very challenging to that in a completely public, open forum.
In this day and age, absolutely.
Yeah, and yet, you can see the rationale of it. We're a public asset and a resource, so you should know what we're doing, how we're making decisions, and on what basis we're doing those. It is a real challenge. I'm going to...
Can I pass on something that I stumbled on that might help people on the phone? Most boards have executive sessions. In fact, should if you have a good board and so forth. In boards I'm on, we had a new CEO, and I didn't want to call it executive session, so I stumbled on using the phrase conversations with the CEO. The mindset of the board changed dramatically. So instead of thinking like an executive session and it was how executive sessions run, it had to be conversations with the CEO. The CEO felt very comfortable sharing what was going on, and people asked questions. It came across more like you're having dinner together and talking than an executive session. So the thing I would pass on, it's amazing how that little change in the heading has worked.
Good idea. We only have a few more minutes. I want to give each of you a chance for closing observation in a moment. But one of the skill sets that I didn't hear you talk about, and this is difficult to embrace, but with the complexity of the industry, with the rapid change, I wonder how you'd look at developing scenarios for the future and getting conversations with CEO, as you just talked about, Dick, or with other colleagues or maybe committees. Given these kinds of scenarios, how would we govern differently to give permission for people to think about and talk about governing in these alternative scenarios? And the art of using scenarios is a function of how you invite people in sometimes to be speakers or to be a resource to catalyze the thinking of the board. We talked about bringing an attorney in to talk about some of those challenges. I wonder if I could get a quick response from each of you of where you found it useful to bring in outside speakers to engage in maybe more conversation or education to help the board climate and the board effectiveness flourish. Thank you, Laura. You talked about the attorney, and then we'll go to Dick and then finish with you, Brian. And then I'll give you a chance for a closing comment about consultation and advice that you'd like to share with some of your colleagues that are board chairpersons.
We did a strategic retreat and absolutely brought outsiders. What I found on this healthcare board is there was 4 relatively new people, all great skills and business people, but didn't even know the healthcare terminology. And so the speaker kind of gave the state of healthcare and with what we know is going to happen and what we don't know is going to happen. And did a really nice job grounding the entire board in what was going on in healthcare. And that was really helpful. What we learned from all the new people is they literally needed a focus on healthcare terms. For non-healthcare board members, you really have one in Diligent or Board Books or whatever you're using to really help them. And I know as I'm hearing that Finance, Audit, and Compliance Committee, I make the show anytime he puts an acronym in a slide, he's got to spell it out first and then he can use the acronym. because we have our own language. And for new board members, that's really difficult. But I say, particularly with what's going on in healthcare now, where you need expertise, going out of the company is really helpful.
Good. How do you react to this opportunity to bring in outside ideas and thinking?
I think still amazing, when I was looking way back, you couldn't be unless you were back 50 miles away. It must be long now than 50 miles. But boards still have some of that. If you have thorny issues, you almost have to bring someone in, gets it all out on the table. It's hard to do that as a board if you've got issues you're dealing with. And the thing is, I would pass on is what you touched on is the scenario planning. If it is going to get difficult, like we touched on, well, now's the time to start playing it out and say, all right, if it does mean that and we have to lay off people, how many people, and you understand, the full effect of that and so forth. It's better to do it now than wait till you have no choice.
Thank you. Brian?
As I mentioned before, we're looking at the idea of developing a governance academy for board members of these community health centers here in Minnesota, because from each other, to start with looking with other board chairs. But part and parcel of the process of we're not separate from the CEOs and from management. We want to do it in conjunction with them. So that the idea of putting this kind of educational activity for board members as part of the annual conference for these community health centers, so that we could partner with the CEOs and the management teams, so we're not off on our own. So the idea of learning from other boards is going to be critical, we think, going forward.
Great. Well, thank you all. Good thinking, good experience that you've shared. We're out of time, but I just want to go around and see if you'd like to make a closing observation. We'll start with Dick, and then Brian and Lori, and then I'll bring it to a wrap-up.
I think being a board, I think it's a unique time because I noticed that boards, management, they act a lot more like a team now. So we seem to all be on the same page as opposed to maybe how it was 15 or 20 years ago. Good. So it's a fun time.
Great.
It is a challenging period of time, certainly. And so not only does the board chair have to partner up with the CEO, but also has to manage the board itself. And the board members are at different points in terms of their understanding. So you have to, as Lori mentioned earlier, you have to make sure that everyone is at the same level in terms of terminology and things of that sort, and bring people along. Don't lose board members, because some people will lose interest. If they don't understand what's going on, they may lose interest. So be aware of that and bring board members along, either through a mentoring process or educational process. Help them, because they need assistance at times because of the complexity of the healthcare world.
Thank you, Lori.
Like, pick your battles. What battles are worth fighting, and do you have shared goals? Really, to Dick's point, as a team, both management and the board want the organization to be successful, and can you figure out how to hold that center and balance your way through the turmoil with what's going on right now? And that it's a really important time to work together on things, but not lose what each board member really brings to the table, which sometimes is asking good questions. When I left one board, as they roasted me, one of the things that they were clear on is that I had made the management team better, because in their prep meeting they always said, what is Lori going to ask? And I gave them the little things around the bands around their wrists, and it said, what would Lori ask? And I said, really, if you think about it that way, you're prepared to move in. I think asking the questions for curiosity and to keep everyone on the same page is really important, but pick which battles you really want to fight. And I think now, with so much else going on, our role really is to support the management team and help balance these turbulent times, is probably what all the consultants are saying.
Great. Thank you, all three of you, very much. A reminder for our colleagues that have joined us on this webinar, we have 3 webinars coming up in this series. The 31st, we'll be looking at the challenges challenge of governing systems between local boards and system boards. Webinar 3 will be on June 7th at 1 o'clock, looking at the relationship between boards and physicians. And finally, on June 19th, looking at some new technologies that can help support the implementation of the good wisdom that was shared with us today. Thank you all very much for your service on your boards and for our industry. Thank you for taking time to be with us. We adjourn the webinar.